Welcome back to the fourth of this five-part series on the progression of infectious diseases and the treatment with herbal medicine of epidemics. And so what we're up to, having been through prevention and the early phases of constriction, the wind phase when it first begins, then we looked at the heat phase of when things get febrile and inflammatory, the different aspects of what can go through that. Now, the next phase that we're looking at, so that's like the third phase of once you're sick, is the fluid phase, right? And so the fluid phase is where, what I'm calling the fluid phase, because, just to remind you, I made up this model. It's drawn upon classical sources, but it's just Jimmy's model here. What I'm calling the fluid phase is where we see the dysregulation and the stagnation of fluids, right? And so the easiest and most literal version of this is the accumulation of mucus on the lungs, right? And so there's that clear mucus accumulation. And so one possibility is that happens as someone's passed through those phases that I've outlined previously, sequentially, right? And then they're probably going to have a hot accumulation of fluid on their lungs. Another possibility is that people can sometimes seemingly skip the hot phase entirely, get a cold, get a runny nose, be averse to cold and closed pores and all that sort of stuff. And then once the pores are closed, the pores of the lungs are closed, then the smoky vapours, in terms of phlegm, accumulates very quickly on the lungs and just goes straight to the lungs. And so they go from a wind constriction phase of a runny nose, and then instantly they've just got all this mucus accumulation. And so that would be still a cold pattern, and the tongue is likely to be white. They're likely to still have an aversion to cold and to feel like they want to be rubbed up. The urine could be still clearer and running more profusely at that particular point. And they're unlikely to have they could have an elevated temperature, because when you're sick you have an elevated temperature, but not a significantly elevated temperature. And that's what that looks like when you've got the cold aspect of the fluid phase. Now, the other fluids that are congested, obviously, is the lymph, right? And so we can see that happening. So you can have cold fluid congestion in the lymph where it's less red, it's less sore, it's less angry, but we can still see that congestion, right? And you might feel it in the inguinal glands, on the neck, or under the armpits. You might be able to actually, or mastite, you might be able to see, the women might notice that there's congestion in the breasts as the lymph all congeals, because the lymph is that great white river, right, the highway of the immune cells and the sewage system in one, and so of course it gets congested. And so this is that herb that I'm championing in this regard is bay laurel, the herb of Apollo, the sun god, that is used for pestilence and is used for the lungs, has a warming, pungent quality, but has a great action upon the lymph. And it also warms the gut, right? So the other fluids that we can see congealing at this time, underneath cold or heat, because they both congeal fluids in different ways, and I'm focusing on cold at the moment, is you'll see the tongue get white. You see that awful white layer to the tongue, and then we're seeing that the whole mucous membranes, right, are all congested at that point. And so we've got changes in the probiome, we've got viral replication happening throughout the GI tract, right? And so we're saying all through there. And so that's relevant in our treatment, is that primarily the traditional focus is on the gut in terms of phlegm across multiple traditions. In Chinese medicine, I say the gut, the spleen, is the origin of phlegm, and the lung is the container of phlegm. It flows up and over. Ayurveda, all disease begins in the gut. And the Western tradition as well, all of the humours that, including the phlegmatic humour, is the result of imperfect coction, metabolism and digestion that takes place in the gut and then the liver. And so there's a metabolic origin as well to mucous membranes that are congested, right? Even if there's a viral component to it, right? And so we've got those different areas inside the cold pattern. How does that sound so far?
So if we just stick with the cold pattern, we've got this accumulation of phlegm. So when we're talking about our Western traditional language, we want to apply plants that are warm and phlegm resolving.
That's right. So they're not the dispersing herbs, because we can't just get it out anymore. It's not just out here. We need to help cook down the mucus that's on the lungs and that's in the gut. Sure. And so they're more warming, right, at this point.
Right. Because
and
then,
so they're warming in the 3rd degree, Galen would say, not warming in the 2nd degree, warming in the 3rd degree. Great. They're hotter at this point. They're resolving all of that.
Okay, great. So some examples of those.
So depending on the body system, we can target them more specifically. But a range of our classic pectorals and our expectorants here are like thyme, right, which is hot in the 3rd degree, and it's very good at if it's a cold pattern. All those immune stimulating kind of thyme kind of connection in that regard. What else have we got? We've got actually laurel is also warm in the 3rd degree. Oregano is warm in the 3rd degree. Oregano oil you could use in this way. We can use hyssop as well. Hyssop is definitely a great one for the lungs in this regard. That's also warming in the 3rd degree, opening the lungs and helping resolve all that mucus.
Great. So the idea is that we can't just disperse it. We need to break it down a little bit.
Yes.
And its nature is cold, so we break it down with heat,
greater heat to cook it.
And then it can be resolved more
That's right.
easily
And these herbs are having actions that are not just opening up all the pores, whatever that means in biochemistry, but are more aggressively increasing and stimulating metabolic processes. Something like this. Now, these kind of herbs can get supported, one by, my beloved elderflower, which still will help the everything open, because we want all those little channels open. We want all those little poroi, as the Greeks call them, all the little channels open, so that that can take place. But we can also support it with going back to our sweet tonics. Angelica and elecampane also come in here. Now, elecampane is very good for when they've got this deep accumulation of mucus on the lungs. Wood says that it's, I think the elecampane cough is moist below, dry above, and thick yellow-green mucus as well. So that's where he's using those. And other herbs of relevance, even if they're not classically associated with the lungs, are the digestive warming medicines here as well. And so we could come to bayberry, Thomsonian medicine. We could come to cinnamon, and all of the spices here as well can reinforce and assist in this. Even something that you wouldn't think of and have used like this previously, say like the New Zealand herb horapito. I have no knowledge of it being used in this particular way, but because of its spicy quality, and we know it's used for fungal infections and we use it in this way, it could very well support a classic pectoral herb that we know enters into the lungs, an expectorant herb, to support it in that general dynamic.
Great. And then what about if the nature of the phlegm is hot?
Yes. So if someone's moved through a hot phase and then it goes to their fluids and they get a strong chesty component of it, then where it's rather than cold thickening the sap in a way,
hardening the sap,
hardening, and that's right, in the same way that it does with your circulation. When it gets cold, it gets sluggish and thick, and when we get hot in summer, then we drink more and the blood gets thinner, right? And so it rarefies. Heat does that. The cold congeals like this. How heat congeals is it cooks it down.
Like that reduction.
It reduces it, it bakes it up. It's like egg white being fried. And so if someone's been through the heat phase and then it goes under the lungs, then we're more likely to see the urine will be a darker colour. We're more likely to see that the pulse is still bounding and full. We're more likely to see that the coat of the urine the coat of the tongue could have a yellow colour to it. And what they're expectorating or blowing out of their nose could also be coloured, yellow or green. So it's really going to show the progression in this regard, and it'll be approached as a hot phlegm at that particular point in time. And so that's where we don't want to use these hot expectorants like thyme, obviously, because they could aggravate the cytokine storm, to give it the COVID example.
And aggravate that cooking down as well.
That's right.
Aggravate that reduction.
Yes. And so they're classically contraindicated. Instead, the herbs that have been found to be most useful in those kinds of chesty coughs that are hot are going to be things like pleurisy root, which helps with the fluid on the lungs in that regard. Or I use frankincense as well. It's can be used at this point, but it's not as classically cooling. We can use a range of the strong draining medicines like andrographis come into play here as well. There's a lot of those strong cooling, getting rid of heat that can then be used on the chest as well. They don't just be, they're very relevant at this point. They can be used to drain, and our berberine herbs become relevant at this point as well. So they can all be used when it's on the chest still at this point, and they help resolve that yellow phlegm. Then the final pattern, whilst we're talking about the lungs, I think, is that when you get a mixed pattern almost, where you've got phlegm that gets, and this is the COVID pattern, where phlegm that gets dry on the trachea and on the lungs, right? And so there is phlegm, there's signs of phlegm, but they are, like the COVID cough is like hardly a cough, right? It's certainly not a whooping cough. It's certainly not a Drosera, sundew, spasmodic cough, or a black cohosh, spasmodic cough. And it's also not the cough of elecampane, where there's that thick accumulation of fluids, right?
It's almost like crusty and dry.
That's right. There's not a lot of cough. It's a little bit of a bark when it's there, but you can see that the lungs, they're not expectorating. So dry coughs where the mucus is baked on and it's cooked on, and it's mucus but it's dry, right? So it's a contradiction here. Require a different treatment entirely. And there's a handful of medicines that I'm familiar with that are useful here. So one of them is bloodroot in small doses, thanks to the eclectics, dry cough. It's very, very hot, but in small doses through a counter-irritant effect, it can loosen up dry coughs. The other one is usnea. Like the bronchial tree, the way it looks, you can see in this regard. It can be very useful in dry coughs. I've found a penicillin alternative. It's also useful in the lower tract as well, urogenital tract. And frankincense, but I mix the frankincense personally with dispersing lung herbs like rosemary and potentially hyssop as well, that are going to help open up in this regard. Peppermint, there's eucalyptus. Eucalyptus is a really first choice in all those things, and that can open up as well as then scrape. It's like fighting glue with glue, because frankincense is really this gluey sort of quality. It's like, well, why would you use mushrooms for candida, or something like this? You think of it like this, because it's very gluey, but it has a scraping quality that can help resolve tough baked on
it's
mucus.
Almost like it has this affinity for the nature of that mucus, and so it almost like binds onto it or something.
Using blue tack to get blue tack off.
That's exactly what I just thought of.
Yeah, it's something like this. It's an unusual one, right?
Okay, cool.
Because it's an unusual pattern. But we often find things coexisting, especially as the disease progresses. You will find heat alongside cold potentially, and dryness alongside moisture, because there's only so much moisture in the body. If it all gets concentrated in one area, then other areas are going to be dry as well. And so that's where our formulas need to have breadth, and they need to address multiple different patterns. So that's the dry cough, right?
Yeah, and the dry mucus.
The dry mucus, that's right. That it's a different pattern entirely. Yeah. So then we move on for the cough. We've spoken about the need to support the body with angelica and elecampane at this phase. Is that right? We've mentioned that they can give broad support as the body is weakening. So from there, you either get better and off you cough and over you go, and it's wonderful. You blow it out, you snot it out, you eject it through those channels. The body, that's the channel that's opening, right? You weren't able to sweat it out, but you are able to cough it off and get it off your chest, right? If you're unable to, and especially if you've passed through the hot phase and your core reserves are starting to wane, then the next complication at the layer of the fluids is where fluids get dysregulated and they also become used up and deficient. And so this is a tricky one. This could be the hardest one for the naturopaths to get their head around. So I'm going to need your help to make sure I'm making a lot of sense here. And so here we're not talking about overt mucus anymore. We've spoken about that in the gut and the lungs. But there is a concept in Greek medicine called the essential humidity. And it's the opposite of the innate heat. So the body's innate heat, the fire that sort of does everything, the activity of everything. And then the reserves, the waters of life out of which life springs, right? That provide the material basis, like a battery that has fluid in it so that the spark can come. If you don't have the fluid in the battery, you can't make the spark. It's the difference between those two charges in this fluid, right? And so the image that I think is used by our Galenic ancestors from Galen on through is of the lamp and the way in which it must draw upon the oil. And if the oil goes out, then the lamp can go out. And the oil here is an aspect of fluid. And it's not a literal fluid as such. It's our biological reserves.
So, from what I understand, our essential humidity is a principle, essentially, and it can manifest in different ways in the body. So it's kind of like the lining of our mucous membranes, but also our parasympathetic nervous system and
cortisol and a range of these things. It's the core petrol in the tank, in a way, the fuel, the biological reserve. It's been likened to a fluid in a well, right? And if you've been through a debilitating illness, then the fluid's getting thicker and more abundant is a relatively superficial stage compared to when the fluids start to get thin. You start to get weak. You start to get exhausted, right? And this is where you get different patterns starting to happen, where you get like a hectic fever. And a hectic fever is similar to an asthenic fever, an exhausted fever where the person is collapsing and they come in and out of it, and they'll get it just in the afternoon. It'll just peak, and we spoke about tertians and quaternions and these cycles that were probably associated with malaria, but there's a deep collapse happening at this point, right?
So it's really our essence.
That's right.
Depleted.
That's right. The essence is being depleted. In Ayurveda, they speak about ojas, which is a liquid, like kind of amrita liquid, kind of, And in Chinese medicine, they speak about jing, which is this kind of vital fluid, which is concentrated qi, in a way. It's these sorts of fluids, right, that start to get consumed. And at this point, that's when that fever is happening, and there's a deep asthenia, deep exhaustion taking place, that we use a different class of medicines altogether. We're no longer trying to drain anything, right? We're trying to nourish. And at this point, those medicines that are given are unusual medicines we're not used to anymore, right? That's where valerian could be used, which was a tonic. So we just use valerian to get to sleep, and we forget about all the complex ginseng-like qualities that it has, the way in which it was a cordial and it builds one up. And so it's used for these kind of fevers.
So we're looking at a class of medicines that replenish our vital essence.
That's right. They put the fuel back in the tank.
Okay.
Right?
And they're ones
when you're starting to get feverish and hot, but in an empty, exhausted way, especially if someone's very old, right? And the tongue at this point might start to peel. They might you might see they've got a kind of red, flushed cheeks, but kind of pale behind it. Right. You see, this is a picture of someone's actually properly sick. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so we're not just talking about fluids in terms of phlegm anymore. We're talking about
vital fluids.
In our,
yes. Okay. And they could have lost vital fluids through depleting sweat, right? Which is why you'd want to use those astringing herbs to bind up earlier on, when the sweat is just robbing that core vitality. This is what cinchona bark was really used for. We don't use that so much anymore. So we're seeing someone in the beginning of collapse. So the progressed phase of the fluid phase is where those vital fluids are being exhausted, and we need to prop the person up, and they've got a different kind of fever, and you don't want to give them your andrographis, which is a full fever, a pitta fever, an earlier fever, an acute fever,
because the vital force has been able to respond in its fullness and do
it's
that
raging,
strong
and
fever.
it's maybe raging too strongly, but at this point
there's just nothing.
That's right. And so the fever that happens is like the fever of my car when I don't put water in the radiator. So it gets hot and starts to steam, but it's not that it's too hot, it's that it's not moist enough. That's the picture.
So you mentioned valerian, there's also American ginseng.
American ginseng is an amazing herb that we should be drawing upon here. And it tonifies in that deep manner, right? What else? Then we could be using tonics that are, American ginseng is probably as deep as it gets in that one. It's the strongest one that we've got there. But valerian, asparagus root was a classic of Galen as well. And it can be used in this. It has a cool, energetic. It will open the channels and allow heat to pass out, particularly through the urine, right? But it has a tonic quality. It's a root. It firms up the root. Your tap root is getting weak, right? And at this point is when the person is there. Your alarm bells are going when you see someone like at this particular phase. Those are the main ones. Have I missed any here?
Vetiver?
I use vetiver because it grows in my region. It's like valerian. It has that root quality, a grounding quality. It can build up and hold. It's used in malarial fevers.
Yes.
We're essentially looking for a very unique form of tonification that happens at the bottom end of this.
It's interesting that a lot of them are roots because you have that image of, that taproot tapping back into the soil to re-nourish itself and grab nutrients.
Yeah, and at this point, if you just give feverfew, it's not enough. It won't hurt, but it's not enough. Yeah. At this point, if you would give strong purgatives, Granny's going to fall off the perch. Even if it's not Granny, and it's a hale and hearty 28-year-old that's really, really sick with COVID, you're exhausting them. It's the wrong process. We want to hold them together at this point, right? And so those are the kind of medicines that are given, and they're used in acute illnesses, and we've forgotten that. And so we just use valerian now. We don't use it as a tonic. We don't use it as a cordial. We don't use it to build people up, to build their nerve force anymore. And we don't use it in agues and hectic fevers, but it can be, and that's where it belongs, right? So that's the bottom phase of what happens, and it's the beginning of the end. It's like that's when things are getting serious. We can see that, right? And so that's what happens. So the fluid phase. First, the superficial fluids, the gross fluids, then the subtle fluids, those deep, vital fluids. They're not literal fluids, and those start to get used up. That's like cortisol being a kind of a fluid, a cooling, anti-inflammatory reserve.
And what about things like our demulcents?
So the demulcents here, so we could use, at this point, if you happen to be nursing someone, right, and they're exhausted, we can use demulcents at different phases through this point. One, if someone just has a normal dry cough, then the demulcent herbs, licorice and mullein, we could also use asparagus root here, can all be helpful at this point. Two, we can use demulcents if someone has that dry cough, then the demulcent herbs won't get it off, in the same way that the hot herbs won't. It'll bake it on harder, but they can help provide relief. It'll feel good. Marshmallow as well. Amazing. I don't have anything like this. Not exactly like these herbs in the East. These are quite precious Western herbs. At the bottom, those herbs aren't deep enough. They aren't deep enough to replenish, to reach in and stimulate and nourish and hold the vital force to generate that essential humidity in those fluids, right? They don't do that, but they can kind of be like an IV drip and just replenish it. They don't go all the way in, but they sort of put that, so they're a part of the convalescent diet. And so we used slippery elm. In America, they used it in the pioneer days to build people up after a debilitating illness as well, right? And so that's helping with the probiome and all this other sort of things like this. It's got all these different qualities attached to it, but dynamically, it's giving a little bit of that essential humidity and it's putting those fluids back in. Think of them as IV drips, but they need to be accompanied with those deeper energetics of something like Quinquefolia, American ginseng, shatavari, asparagus root.
Another sort of almost final fluids piece is that fluid retention. So while we're losing that vital essence, it's not just losing that vital essence, but it's getting redistributed a little bit. So we have fluids pooling in some areas as well.
So we can see one of the signs, thank you for that, one of the signs that we can see happening at this point is dysregulation of the fluids in terms of edema as well. And so you can, on the one hand, you could have a pooling, you could have a dry cough up here, and on the other hand, you could have increased fluid retention around the ankles. In particular, if someone's had a grueling and debilitating illness and they've been in bed for a period of time, right? We start to have signs of edema happening. And if the illness is strong enough, then we're seeing that this is because the kidney's ability to kind of process them underneath the burden of the smoky vapours, underneath their metabolic burden of just dealing with the side effects of mounting an immune response and all that vital activity, then it can't drain away those fluids anymore. And so that's where we would want to, if it's at a serious level, then we want to use a strengthening, warming, nourishing diuretic. And my favourite is juniper, for what it's worth, right? My favourite is juniper. Yeah, that's the one that I would use there. You could use buku, and you could use celery seed. You could use a range of others. If there's the toxic heat picture, then that's when we can use something that's a little bit more draining, like berberis, which is going to increase the urine flow as well, like that. If they've got that hectic fever and that emptiness, then that's one of the things that you're going to get a little bit of that action happening through asparagus root. Another one from the Western tradition that's neglected is cypress, the master of blood, sweat and tears, a binding and stabilising action. So if somebody's got sweat that is exhausting them, it's debilitating, it's no longer helpful, they're exhausted and they're just hemorrhaging atoms, hemorrhaging the elements like we spoke about in the beginning, hemorrhaging pneuma, because it's too open. So we've looked at constriction, and now we're getting to this point where we've got dilation. We need to firm up. So that's why there's a bogginess. That's through all of these phases, is that we're looking, that's where tannins come in. They have a strengthening action. They're binding, astringing. We want to use those astringents at that particular point. Oak bark, give you the strength of the mighty oak, sacred to Thor, like an incredible herb from the West that has so many actions at so many different levels in this area, so we can use those to bind and strengthen there as well. So this is a big piece. Can you help me to clarify where have I skipped too quickly across this?
I don't think you've skipped too quickly, but I think the take-home piece is that within fluid dynamics, fluid isn't just wet, and fluid isn't just about mucus. So we have the mucus and the phlegm, and we have the vital fluids as well.
Yes.
And then from what I heard from you, it can be either hot or cold, and it can also be dry.
Yes. So we've got frank fluids, which are fluids that you can pull out with your fingers, right? The thick fluids, the gross fluids. And then we have subtle fluids. And subtle fluids are life-enhancing, and they are perhaps something like cortisol, as cortisol reserves. There's all sorts of small micronutrients and biological products that are necessary for maintaining homeostasis, and that's the image of the oil in the lamp, and the oil in the lamp is being consumed, and at that point we need things that will put oil back in the lamp. That's those fluids, right? And this is the language we have. Well, the only language we have is metaphor, right? But it guides us to say, despite this being a metaphor, well, science uses metaphors too, despite it being a metaphor, it's what has been clinically proven by our ancestors when they were battling hectic fevers like this. And we haven't had to do this in the West for several generations. So we draw upon that language so it can guide those medicines. Right?
And as far as those frank fluids go, like mucus, for example, it can be cold, as in it hardens and binds the mucus, or it can be hot, as in it's been cooked down and reduced. And the nature of those is different, and it's really important to differentiate between those.
That's
two,
right,
so
and that's intuitively quite easy to do.
Yeah.
The person will be a bit warmer or a bit cooler, and you'll see that the nature of mucus is more white.
Yes.
Yeah, and
we'll see the tongue as well.
That's right, and you can go through those layers. Like if it's not too strong and it's a kid or they're elderly, we can use angelica and elecampane. If it's much stronger, then we can go to something more heating like thyme. We go through the layers like this. Yeah. So those are the layers of fluid, and that's the third layer. And the fourth layer is what we're going to look at next.